Thanks, and I haven't even really done anything. Hey, so CSS parser extensions. My name is Bramus. That's a lot of social media info. I typically always use this slide in my presentations because, warning, I am with Chrome DevRel, which is also pretty interesting because I'm with Chrome DevRel, so I get to approach web problems from this naive point of view as a web developer versus not as a browser engineer, which I think is like a nice balance. So the goal of this thing right here is to start a conversation about this problem that I think we are having, well, the web in general is having, and maybe hopefully we can come up with a solution for that. So there's this new CSS feature that you have built, that your team has built. Amazing, we'll ship it. And typically the timeline looks something like this, where yay, it's in Chrome or Chromium. Then another browser vendor catches up, another browser vendor catches up, and like this is the typical timeline, but it could also be something more like this, where Firefox is a bit closer to the other, to Safari, or it could be flipped around, where Safari is first and we are like second, and so on and so on. But generally speaking, this is typically a timeline of how features on the web land. Not all features, of course. What you can see on this timeline is a clear separation. You can like cut this thing in half, where everything before the last browser or the last of the three big browser vendors shipped it is called pre-baseline. And then after that, the feature is called baseline newly available. So this is a term that we DevRel are using. You have something is not in baseline, so it's not in the big three browser engines. Something is baseline newly available. Yes, Eric, you are hearing me. That's correct. So, okay. And then also, you can make a second cut on this chart, namely where something is baseline widely available, and that is 2.5 years after the feature became baseline newly available. So there is a clear timeline, what you can see. Now, the problem with this chart is the part on the left, because this thing right here that can take up from somewhere between 6 months up to 10 years or even longer before the feature is in all browser engines. Whoops. So that means that we have a bit of a problem, because when the feature is baseline widely available, that is the cutoff point that a lot of web developers use to like go all in on a certain CSS feature. And that's a long time between when we shipped it and when it's actually there. So it's like, typically you're talking about 3 to 4 years, maybe 5 before the feature is like really baseline widely available. How we, as DevRel, currently deal with this as well, we go to developers who say like, hey, have you heard about this thing called progressive enhancement? Where we basically say like, okay, this feature is not in all browsers, but it's safe for you to use. Something like, for example, text wrap pretty. Slap it on your page. If the browser supports text wrap pretty, great, your text will be nicely wrapped. If not, well, nothing bad happens, right? The content is still there. You can still see the content. All great, fine and dandy. Same thing, CSS interpolate size allow keywords to do height to intrinsic sizing keywords. Great, slap it on there. You get the status quo, which is the thing just toggles, or you get the nice, rich and enhanced experience where the thing animates. Easy to convince people about this. More difficult features to convince people about something are things like scroll-driven animations. That is because yeah, they like this thing to be put on the website, but to sell it as a progressive enhancement, it's a bit problematic, because one of my colleagues, whose name I've redacted, said, well, progressive enhancement becomes a challenge when C-level folks are using iPhones and can't see the feature. If they throw thousands of dollars on the developer adding it to the website and they can't see it on their iPhone, yeah, they won't likely like to pursue that one. Our response to that is, well, if you don't like the progressive enhancement route, use a polyfill. Like polyfill it, and then some JavaScript will like take over and then make sure that like also on an iPhone you get to see, for scroll-driven animation specifically, you also get to see the scroll-driven animation on there until Safari ships it, which will happen soon, by the way. There are some prerequisites though for a CSS polyfill, like for a good CSS polyfill, is that the feature can entirely replace a third-party solution. So like there's no use in us offering a CSS polyfill for a CSS feature, because what we see is that web developers don't want to maintain two code paths. They don't want to have the fallback experience. For example, like something with popover, there are like a bunch of libraries out there. They don't want to use toast.js for browsers with no popover support, and then do the rest with popover, whereas toast.js offers some extra things that popovers can't really do. And yes, we need to close that gap, but in reality, there are always some small differences, which are sometimes blockers. Yes. So the requirements for a polyfill, if they are convinced of, yes, we're going to use this polyfill, great. There are some requirements which I see on my screen, but not on this screen, which is interesting. Yes. Okay, I just have to go back and forth again. So the polyfill needs to be small. It also needs to just work. Like preferably what web developers use is they load up the polyfill and they do not need to change anything in their build steps or whatever. They do not need to invoke any methods. The polyfill should just take things over. And also it should be feature complete, which is sometimes pretty difficult to do. Like some CSS features or some features that rely on certain parts of CSS can't be polyfilled. But a colleague of mine and also my manager, Philip Walton, back in 2016, he wrote this blog post about the dark side of polyfilling CSS, and it basically boils down to this. If you have never tried to write a CSS polyfill, you have probably never experienced the pain of writing a CSS polyfill. Yes, it is extremely, extremely hard to do. So to let you get a little taste of the pain that you have to endure to write a CSS polyfill, the problem basically boils down to the fact that the CSS parser discards what it can't understand, which is like something really powerful about CSS. You can write stuff in there that an old browser doesn't support, and yes, your page will still render fine on that old browser with all the remaining CSS that it does understand, which is like the most powerful thing, I think, well, one of the most powerful things about CSS, but it's also working against us when trying to write a CSS polyfill. So for example, here's a little simple style block. I have a background color with a value invalid, which is not a valid background color. And also I have a size to rem in there. Size is a new CSS property that is about to land in the spec, I think, but it's not supported by any browser right now at this very moment. So if you load this up, you basically just end up with the element have a color blue and all the other declarations get thrown out of the window. So that is the powerful thing, but also the problem we need to work around if you're trying to write a CSS polyfill. So how you do it as a CSS, as a author of a polyfill, it's a three-step approach. It looks very simple, but it's very, very complicated. You gather all the styles, you parse all the styles, and you apply the styles. Easy, right? Not exactly. Gathering all the styles. Well, you need to read your styles from various sources. Document style sheets, adopted style sheets, also element attached styles. So you basically need to get in your markup as well if you want to do really, really properly. You need to watch out for mutations, of course, because then some things can change, like new style sheets can be dynamically injected, adopted style sheets can change, element attached styles can also change. Once you have all those gathered, all your sources, you need to parse them. But you then have to deal with course. If your style sheet is loaded on external origin, you can't just read it. So external style sheets, too bad, you can't parse them. And then you have to do what the browser does. You have to tokenize and parse the entire style sheet, which seems a bit absurd because the UA already did that for you. But you have to do it yourself in your JavaScript code. And then, of course, you have to stay up to date with all the CSS syntax, because if your browser support then something new, then your own tokenizer and parser will also need to support it. For example, add layer that got added later on. And if your tokenizer doesn't see that, well, too bad. So everything in add layer that you want to polyfill won't be polyfilled at that point in time. So you as an author of a polyfill, you need to constantly maintain your polyfill to stay up to date with all the syntax changes. And then applying the styles. So once you have say that you manage to parse all the styles, then you have to apply them. Basically, you have to write your own cascade, right? You have to figure out, okay, which rules now apply to which element, under which conditions, set up a bunch of listeners like media queries or style queries that change, also document resize. And it's like, in summary, it's pretty crazy. Like run your own parser and cascade as a JavaScript developer to polyfill something in CSS. That is just not that great, I think. So what if, that was a long intro, I know, sorry. What if we had something like CSS parser extensions, where the pitch is, well, the CSS parser discards what it can't understand. Instead of doing this, where you run your own parser and cascade, like, what if we could teach a CSS parser some new tricks? What if developers of polyfills could teach a CSS parser some new tricks? And yes, I'm deliberately using this magic wand thing because this might remind you of Houdini from back in the day. There is some/big overlap with it. So I was thinking of, what if in JavaScript you had something like css.parser where you could access the CSS parser, and then you could do things like, this is just me brain dumping some things. What if you could say, CSS.parser register a certain syntax, where you define a syntax that it can be able to parse. Same with a keyword. I will show you some examples on the next slides. Register keyword, also with a function, like a built-in function, not one of the custom functions, but like a built-in function, and also a property. Like, hey, if you encounter this property that you don't understand, whatever I pass in here, that thing will take over and do all the thing that we need to do in order to polyfill a CSS property. In addition to like all defining these things like, hey, parser, you now understand all these things, we also would need to define like how they compute, what those properties actually compute to, their computed value when you do get computed style, and also define what to do when an element gets matched or unmatched with that property applied to it, or that should be applied to it. Again, I'm with DevRel. I'm not a browser engineer, so this might be a very, very naive idea, but that's what we're all here for, to start the discussion. Some code, for example, CSS.register keyword, random. Hey, whenever you encounter the random keyword, it will return a number. That's the type that it will return. Caching mode, whenever you CSS, generate me the random number, but keep it cached, like don't always recompute it. And it gets invalidated. Well, it doesn't get invalidated. Like the value that you generated always applies once you have it. And this is what it computes to, return mat.random. So whenever you see a random keyword, return mat.random, you store it once, remember it, nice. Another idea, register function, like the light dark function, which I really, really like. And the light dark function allows you to return one of two colors based on the active color scheme. So if the color scheme is light, the first value will be returned. If the color scheme is dark, the second value will be returned. Well, this is, I think, how we could possibly maybe polyfill it, where we say, this is the syntax for it, we register the function, it gets invalidated when the color scheme of that element changes. So when the computed value, the computed style of that color scheme property changes, here's what it computes to. We get back whatever it parsed. We get the specified style applied to the element. We extract the color scheme from it. If that was light, we return the light argument. If it was dark, we return the dark argument. I think this would be nice, right? To simply be able to write this, and then we have polyfill light dark. Great. Another example, the add rule function, where you can feature the text support for a certain add rule. It's only in Chromium right now behind the experimental web platform features flag. It's not on any other browser vendor. Well, this is how we could support it. Like, hey, if you see add view transition inside of the add rule function, return this JavaScript check that says, is CSS view transition rule, is that thing exists in window? Well, then it's true. Otherwise, like in the end, return false. And you list up all the add rule checks in there. Another one is a size property, which I like, which is a shorthand to set the width and the height in one go. So you register it with a certain syntax. Yes, this coincidentally matches everything that is in the spec about a property. We set the compute to compute the length, but then like when it gets matched, well, instead of setting the size, like return me the width and the height to set onto that element, and then your size works. If you do get computed style of the size, it will return you whatever is in compute to. But in fact, it will set the width and the height onto that element. You have successfully polyfilled the size property. And then I think this is the second to last example where I register property scroll timeline, and I say like whenever you are matching, I could also like tag it on right there. It's a detail. But like whenever this thing gets matched, initialize the resize observer onto that thing because we need to compute what the maximum scroll offset of that element is. And when it gets unmatched, we unregister whatever the resize observer has done. And there's no compute to because whatever we set in scroll timeline, that will be the declared value that gets returned. And then this is the last one, register syntax, which is basically like CSS syntax, which you can register. The benefits of all this is me just like having a wild idea and brainstorming. The benefits, well, to polyfill authors, much easier to author polyfills. They don't need to like get over all these hurdles that I've listed before. The polyfills will be much smaller. I did a check, like the polyfills for CSS anchor positioning would reduce like 85% of its size because that's just 85% of that polyfill is concerned with parsing CSS, which is absurd. Container query polyfill 64%, scroll time polyfill 50%, more performant polyfills, of course, and also more robust polyfill. Like right now, if you check the scroll timeline polyfill, half of the issues are about CSS parsing. Which is very unfortunate. Benefits to us, browser vendors, faster adoption of CSS features. We can now prototype certain things, like in JavaScript. Instead of prototyping in Blink, we can like make a proof of concept pure in JavaScript code, make up like, okay, this is how we think it would work, find some edge cases, land a fix for that in our JavaScript code. Then you have like a proper thing that we can present to the CSS working group. In this case, for example, say like, okay, these are all the things that we thought of. What about it? And if we then get the green line on it, then we can start like actively implementing it in Blink by skipping the prototyping phase because we have prototyped already in JavaScript. And yes, admittedly, it will be a little bit less performant, but it will be more performant than the current CSS polyfills that we have. And also, yeah, this is like the feedback cycle closing. So remember this chart, this timeline from the start. Basically, what I want to do is I want to move this red marker right there. Instead of it being there, I want to move it like way up to here when people can start adopting a CSS feature, or maybe even up to there, because we can now proactively try and make a CSS feature work. Of course, with caveats, like it's not all I don't know the English expression for it, but it's not all like good things. Of course, we need to be very careful. We need to be very careful about the timing of all this because we don't want to run JavaScript code like when the frame is being produced. So we don't want it to be like in between style layout and somewhere in between, like have a bit of blocking JavaScript. Wouldn't be that good. Of course, this falls or stands with buy-in from all browser vendors because if we have this in Chromium eventually, maybe who knows. Well, if other browser vendors don't support this, then you can't really polyfill the features in their browsers. And also with the asterisk, like not every CSS feature can be polyfilled. Like something like view transitions, for example, you wouldn't be able to use this technique to polyfill view transitions. And that's it. Time for discussion, feedback.
All right, we have some questions? Yep.
Hey, Rob Paveza from Microsoft. I was just curious, how does the Parser extension know when to not activate because now the thing that you were implementing has been implemented?
Great question. The thing is, a registration done through this mechanism would override whatever the browser supports. So if you write a polyfill for CSS size, for example, you write it on yourself, you load it up, eventually the browser catches up, your polyfill would still kick in so that your website doesn't break whenever browser support lands. Then as an author of the website, you can then go out and check, like, can I safely yank out this polyfill? If so, well, then yank out the polyfill, and then the native feature will be used.
I'll go to you in 1 second. That was what I was going to ask about actually too. Yeah, it is extremely important. A huge failure mode for new feature development these days is people doing conditional polyfills. And then when the real one lands and they no longer install the polyfill, it acts differently. It breaks the website. We have to back out and choose a different name. It sucks. It happens regularly. So try our best to avoid doing that.
So why wouldn't we then prefix these kinds of polyfill spaces like we did with web components, where there's sort of some namespace that you can use for the polyfill or the polyfill, so that you don't end up in a situation where we have this kind of stomping and this weird out of alignment with the rest of the platform, override behavior, because you're going to end up, for instance, in the case of, for instance, the scroll timeline, with a much lower performance implementation if that polyfill lives longer than the browser support would introduce, right? So you do actually want the conditionality. And so there are ways around this that don't involve us, blessing the idea of camping out on, new namespaced content.
Yeah, very good remark. One of the things that I didn't mention but did think of is like maybe there should be something like if CSS.parser.supports property, and then you can do the conditional thing. But then of course the burden will be up to the web developer to make sure that the polyfill actually matches what the native implementation does.
Well, no, this hasn't been presented to the CSS working group yet, so it's something that we've discussed too.
Oh yeah, the state of this thing is just me having a crazy idea.
Okay, let's go to Gnome on the remote.
Yeah. First of all, as someone who tried to write CSS polyfills in the past, yeah, this is painful. So thanks for trying to fix this problem. One thing I'm thinking about it is to look at it more like a ponyfill than a polyfill. Like, could you write a CSS property like -- size, or a CSS function now that we have them, or a CSS mixing? And rather than have it as a parser extension, have it as a lifecycle extension that you'll know when things change. You'll get events when things change, and you can see, my CSS property that doesn't have a native implementation has changed, and now I can apply something to this element, and then we're not polluting the browser, the UA namespace, but rather we have like this separate kind of on top thing that arbitrates between our own behavior and the browser's native behavior. Just a suggestion of a way to go with it.
Yeah, but one of the issues with that is that when we see authors are trying to polyfill a certain feature on the web, they do want to use like the actual real thing. Like I'm using scroll animations as a great example for this, because currently this is only in Chromium, where authors want to write animation-timeline, scroll-timeline, and so on and so on, and they don't want to resort back to going like, okay, -- animation timeline, which will then polyfill the real animation timeline. Yeah, they basically want to write it in their browser of choice or with their features of choice, and then say, oh, if other browsers don't support it, well, polyfill. Yeah, but I get the idea. Yeah, thanks, Noam.
It's almost a joke question. Have you written a polyfill for this mechanism?
Yes. But I am working around some of the limitations, such as I am basically writing all my styles inline in a style block in the document, so that way I have easy access to the stuff that's in there. I only did @ rule to make it easy for me, but yeah.
Okay, another question from the audience. You're good.
Hey, Kurt from Microsoft. Another advantage to this, I think, is that like sometimes the working groups can have, different proposals that people are kind of, debating through. I think this could actually speed that up too, to say, hey, we have polyfills for both. Here's what it looks like. Here's what the development experience looks like. Like, I think that's another advantage, that this could even speed up kind of deciding on which direction to take a standard.
100% agree. I've also done this before with certain things. Robert Flack, who's sitting over there, also has done it before. But I think it was scroll triggered animations that Rob basically wrote the polyfill in JavaScript, and then I got to play with the polyfill, figure out like, okay, there's some things missing here that is not covered by the syntax, and then we made it better. And now that's the thing that's in the spec. Yeah. Thanks, Kurt.
All right, looks like done with questions. Thank you, Bramus.
Thank you.